They tried to push him off his property, but his secret evidence flipped everything. The sun sat high in the sky, its golden warmth spilling across the quiet suburban street. The air carried the faint hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. Lawns stretched out in neat rectangles, trimmed to perfection, and mailboxes stood like silent sentinels along the curb. On the surface, everything looked like the picture of suburban peace. David knelt in his front yard, shears in hand, carefully trimming the roses that grew along the edge of his garden. Each snip was deliberate, patient, as though tending to the flowers was more than just maintenance. It was a ritual of pride, an act of love. His house stood modestly behind him, a single-story home with fresh cream-colored paint, shutters a calm shade of blue, and a porch swing that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. It wasn't grand, and it wasn't flashy, but it was his, and every corner of it carried his sweat, his savings, and his determination. He paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. The warmth of the sun settled on his skin, and he allowed himself a small smile. After years of long shifts and sleepless nights, he had carved out a life for himself here. The roses bloomed because he tended them. The paint stayed fresh because he had chosen it. The swing creaked because he had hung it. This house wasn't just a property, it was a testament to persistence, to belonging. A car rolled by slowly, its windows half down, music pulsing faintly from the speakers. David glanced up, nodding politely. The driver met his eyes for only a second before quickly looking away. That small exchange left a faint shadow in David's chest, a reminder that not every neighbor saw him as just another homeowner enjoying his Saturday. Some looked longer than they should have, others looked away too fast. And though no one said it outright, David had grown familiar with the weight of being seen as an outsider in a place he had worked hard to call his own. Still, he refused to let that unease take root in the soil of his home. He leaned down again, trimming away a thorny stem, whispering under his breath like a quiet encouragement. Keep growing. Keep blooming. Across the street, curtains shifted in one of the houses. A woman's silhouette stood for a moment, watching, then disappeared. David noticed but said nothing. He straightened, rolling his shoulders, and looked at his yard with a craftsman's pride. The grass, trimmed neatly the evening before, gleamed in the sun. The small birdbath in the corner reflected the sky like glass. His yard wasn't just presentable, it was alive, breathing proof that he belonged here as much as anyone. Yet despite the postcard appearance, a tension lingered in the air. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was the kind of tension that lived in small things. A glance too quick, a smile too forced, a silence too heavy. It threaded itself into the neighborhood like a secret no one wanted to acknowledge. David set the shears down on the porch railing and lowered himself into the swing. The wood groaned softly under his weight, creaking with every movement, but he didn't mind. He leaned back, hands resting on his knees, letting the rhythm of the swing calm him. He could hear the faint sound of children's laughter drifting from 2 streets over, carried by the wind. For a brief moment, he let himself believe that this was enough, that the peace he worked for would remain untouched. The roses nodded in the breeze as if agreeing with him. The swing rocked, the house stood firm, and the sun wrapped the neighborhood in a warm embrace. From the outside, it was an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary place. But beneath the quiet, something unspoken stirred an unease that David could not name, a shadow that had not yet shown itself. He exhaled slowly, unaware that the calm he cherished was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The hum of the lawnmower down the street faded into silence as David pulled open his mailbox. The sun was still bright overhead, and the metal burned faintly against his fingertips. Inside, tucked among grocery flyers and bills, was an envelope, stamped with the seal of the Homeowners Association. He carried it to the porch, tore it open, and unfolded the crisp sheet of paper. His eyes moved over the printed words, and a frown slowly creased his forehead. Violation notice. Fence height exceeds HOA regulation by 4 inches. Please correct immediately to avoid fines. David glanced toward his fence, a simple wooden barrier he had inherited with the house when he bought it. The boards were weathered but sturdy, no taller than they had ever been. He ran a hand over his beard, confusion gnawing at him. 4 inches too high, he murmured to himself. That fence hasn't changed a day since I moved in. For a moment, irritation bubbled in his chest, but he shook it off. Paperwork mistakes happened. Maybe someone in the HOA office had mixed up addresses. He folded the notice neatly, slid it into a drawer inside the house, and told himself not to think too much of it. Days later, another letter arrived. This one, too, bore the HOS official seal. David's hands tightened as he pulled it free and read the contents. Violation. Notice, shutter color does not meet community standards. Please repaint within 14 days to approved colors. David's mouth fell open in disbelief. He turned his head slowly toward the front of his home, where the shutters shone in the afternoon's sun-calm blue. The same shade he had proudly chosen years ago, the same color the HOA had signed off on when he first repainted. He remembered standing on a ladder for hours, brush in hand, sweat dripping down his back, proud of giving the house a look that felt like his own. Now they wanted to call it a violation? His pulse quickened as he read the letter again, searching for sense where there was none. His shutters were exactly the same, unchanged, unchallenged until now. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a mix of frustration and unease creep over him. David set the letter on the table beside the first one, the 2 notices like unwelcome guests staring back at him. For the first time, he felt a shift in the air around his home, a tension he couldn't quite name. The neighborhood that had seemed so ordinary just days ago now felt heavy with suspicion. He tried to dismiss it again. Perhaps someone had filed the paperwork incorrectly. Perhaps the HOA was simply being overzealous, making rounds for the sake of appearing thorough. Still, the thought lingered like a splinter under his skin. Why now? Why him that evening? David stepped onto his porch and looked out at the quiet street. A pair of neighbors walked by, their conversation halting as they caught his eye. One of them offered a quick smile, polite but strained, before they hurried on. Curtains shifted across the road, a flicker of movement quickly disappearing. David folded his arms across his chest. He told himself it was nothing, just coincidence. But deep down he could feel something else beginning to stir. The letters weren't simple mistakes. They were the first whispers of something larger, something pressing in from the edges. The roses swayed in the breeze, their petals soft and bright against the weight in his chest. For now his house stood, the same as ever, but David couldn't shake the sense that the peace he cherished was beginning to crack. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of envelopes. Each one carried the same heavy seal of the Homeowners Association, and each one made David's chest tighten a little more. At first, he opened them with disbelief, hoping to find some explanation, a misunderstanding that would clear itself up. Instead, every letter dripped with accusation. Grass exceeds community standard by 1 inch. Driveway not properly power washed. Mailbox needs repainting to match uniform standard. The words were cold, but David could feel the weight behind them. These weren't professional notices anymore. They read like insults, delivered in the form of official language. He could almost hear the sneer between the lines, as if someone was laughing at the thought of boxing him in. The envelopes piled up on his kitchen table. Their white edges glared back at him whenever he passed by, each one a reminder that the peace of his home was being chipped away piece by piece. Around the neighborhood, the change was subtle but undeniable. People who once waved now gave stiff nods. Others slowed their pace when walking past his yard, eyes darting to his house as if it carried some secret shame. Behind curtains, silhouettes lingered longer than they should, whispering in low tones. Once they thought he was out of sight, not everyone looked at him with disdain. Some faces carried sympathy. A young mother at the end of the street gave him a hesitant smile one morning as she buckled her child into a car seat. But even then, her eyes darted nervously to the house across from his, where a neighbor stood watching. She quickly looked away, guilt written across her face. The isolation pressed down on David more than the letters themselves. He had worked his whole life to belong here, and yet, with every notice, the community seemed to push him further toward the margins. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, David wheeled his trash cans toward the curb. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and gasoline. He left them neatly lined up, the same as always, before heading inside. The next morning, he stepped outside to find both bins tipped over, their contents strewn across the driveway. Plastic wrappers clung to the damp pavement, fluttering in the breeze. But it wasn't the mess that stopped him cold. A note, crudely taped to the side of one overturned bin, flapped against the plastic. His hands trembled as he tore it free. In thick black marker, the words glared back at him. "This isn't your place." For a long moment, David stood frozen, the world narrowing to those 4 words. His chest tightened, heat rising in his throat, and his heart hammered so hard it echoed in his ears. It wasn't just about fences or shutters anymore. This was a message, and it was personal. Anger surged through him, sharp and hot, but beneath it was a current of fear he couldn't deny. The thought crept in, if they were willing to do this, what might come next? Still, David refused to let the fear root itself in his heart. He straightened his back, crumpled the note in his fist, and tossed it into the garbage. His eyes lifted to the house across the street, where blinds twitched before snapping shut. "No," he whispered to himself, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "This is my home." The roses swayed in the garden, the paint on the shutters glowed in the afternoon sun, and the porch swing creaked softly in the breeze. They were reminders of everything he had built here, and David would not be pushed out so easily. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day when the air felt heavy with stillness. David was raking leaves in his front yard, the rhythm of scraping metal against the earth, giving him a small sense of calm. He was lost in thought when a shadow stretched across the lawn. Looking up, he saw a man standing near the sidewalk, clipboard tucked against his chest. The man was dressed in a stiff polo with the HOA logo stitched neatly on the breast, khakis pressed so sharply they looked like they could cut. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but the way he tilted his chin made it clear he had come with authority. "Afternoon," the man said flatly, not offering a smile or even a nod. His voice was clipped, each word delivered like a command. He glanced around the yard with an air of scrutiny, as if he were inspecting the crime scene rather than a home. "I'm here about a few violations," he continued, flipping a page on his clipboard. The plastic snap of the pen echoed louder than it should have. David wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Violations?" he repeated, his tone careful, steady. "I've already received letters. I was told everything was being reviewed." The officer ignored him, pointing toward the wooden fence along the side yard. "This fence is still too high." Against community guidelines, David followed his gesture, his jaw tightening. "That fence has been here since I bought the house. It was approved before I moved in." The man didn't bother to look at him. He scribbled something down, then turned toward the porch. "Shutters too, wrong shade. Doesn't match the rest of the neighborhood palette." David's breath caught in his chest, a mix of frustration and disbelief. "That's nonsense," he shot back. His voice trembled with restrained anger. "I painted them the same color listed in the HOA book. Years ago, they signed off on it. The officer finally turned his head, lowering his sunglasses just enough to meet David's eyes. The look wasn't one of professionalism but of condescension, as if he were sizing up someone who didn't belong. "Rules change," the man said casually, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. "Maybe you didn't get the updated notice." David stepped closer, rake still in hand, his shoulders squared. "I've played by the rules since the day I moved here. Don't stand on my lawn and act like I'm some kind of outsider." The silence stretched for a moment, thick and charged. Then, slowly, the officer slid his sunglasses back up the bridge of his nose and let out a short chuckle. "We'll see how long you last here," he murmured. The words were soft, but the venom in them cut deep. With that, he turned, walking briskly down the driveway. The sound of his shoes against the pavement lingered even after he disappeared around the corner. David stood frozen, rake clutched tight, his knuckles white. The autumn air suddenly felt colder, sharper. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, the officer's threat echoing like a shadow that refused to fade. His gaze drifted back to the porch swing, swaying gently in the breeze as if mocking the fragile peace he once felt in this home. He thought of the roses he had trimmed, the paint he had touched up, the years of hard work poured into every corner of this house. And for the first time, he wondered if all of it, his labor, his pride, his sanctuary, was being pushed toward a breaking point. But deep inside, beneath the fear, a spark ignited. If they wanted a fight, he thought, then they would have one. The letters no longer came in thin envelopes. They arrived thick, stuffed with pages of fines and threats, the kind that landed on David's kitchen table with a heavy slap. Each one carried a price tag: $250 for improper fence height, $500 for non-compliant shutters, $750 for failure to maintain community aesthetic. The numbers spiraled upward until they totaled thousands. The absurdity was breathtaking. His lawn was trimmed, his porch freshly painted, his trash cans lined neatly along the curb. Yet somehow, on paper, his home had become a battlefield of fabricated violations. David would sit at the table, the stack of papers fanned out like a deck of cards designed to break him. His hands trembled as he read line after line, the words blurring together in a sea of bureaucracy and intimidation. He tried to steady his breathing, but each figure printed in bold red ink pressed on his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. Off, neighbors noticed the change too. His laughter, once a fixture on the block, had grown scarce. His garden, though still beautiful, bore the signs of neglect: roses left untrimmed, weeds daring to push through cracks in the soil. He moved slower, spoke less, the strain etching deeper lines into his face. Then, one gray morning, a knock echoed at the door. Not the polite rap of a neighbor, but the cold, deliberate pounding of official business. David opened it to find a man in a suit holding a thick envelope. "Mr. Johnson?" the man asked without inflection. When David nodded, he placed the envelope in his hands. "You've been served." The door clicked shut behind him, but the weight of what lingered was far heavier than the sound. David stared down at the packet, his stomach sinking as if a stone had been dropped inside him. Inside lay a court summons. The HOA had filed a lawsuit, accusing him of breaching multiple regulations and refusing compliance. The words read like a script designed to strip him bare: phrases like willful negligence and failure to uphold community standards scrawled across the pages. They made him sound like a criminal, not a homeowner who had poured his soul into maintaining his sanctuary. His heart raced as he sank into the couch, papers spread across his lap. The living room that once gave him comfort now seemed smaller, its walls inching closer with every breath. Even the family photos on the mantel felt distant, like relics from a life that was slipping through his fingers. At night, he lay awake in bed, the glow of the streetlight spilling faintly through the blinds. He replayed every moment since the first letter: the fence, the shutters, the trash cans overturned. Each memory sharpened into a realization. This wasn't about rules. It was about power. About someone deciding that he didn't belong, and using every tool at their disposal to prove it. David pressed a hand against his chest, feeling the relentless pounding of his heart. The legal machine was vast and faceless, yet it bore down on him with the force of something deeply personal. He could feel it pressing against the very walls of his home, suffocating him, threatening to strip away not just his property, but his dignity. Still, somewhere in the fog of dread, resolve flickered. They wanted him broken, desperate, willing to walk away. But as long as his feet stood on this ground, as long as breath filled his lungs, he wasn't leaving. "This is my place," he whispered to the silence, though the words trembled. "They won't take it from me." But deep inside, David couldn't shake the fear that the battle had only just begun, and that the system, designed to protect him, had already been turned against him. The night stretched long and silent, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the restless shuffle of papers across David's dining table. His kitchen had become a war room. Stacks of letters, photographs of his yard, and a binder filled with notes lay scattered across the surface. He had told himself he wouldn't fight back blindly. If the HOA wanted to bury him in paperwork, he would bury them in truth. At first, his search was methodical, digging through past HOA guidelines, comparing old documents with the so-called updated versions. His eyes ached from hours of reading fine print, but the more he studied, the more holes he found. Dates didn't match. Rules seemed hastily rewritten. Some pages even looked freshly typed, their formatting inconsistent with official records. Frustration gnawed at him, but determination pushed harder. He requested copies of meeting minutes, financial records, anything he could get his hands on. Many requests were stonewalled, but a sympathetic clerk slipped him a packet of documents after hours, whispering, "Be careful with this. You didn't get it from me." Back home, David spread the new papers across the table, his pulse quickening as he scanned each line. And then he saw it. Buried deep within financial statements and board meeting notes was a single page that made his breath hitch. A proposal for a redevelopment initiative pitched to a private developer. It outlined a plan to consolidate properties, tear down existing homes, and replace them with high-value townhouses. At the center of the highlighted map sat his property. David's eyes widened, the realization hitting like a blow to the chest. The fines, the threats, the intimidation, it wasn't random. His house wasn't just inconvenient, it was essential. His home sat right in the middle of the planned expansion, the keystone in a scheme designed to turn profit at the expense of every family who stood in the way. His mind raced, replaying every encounter. The clipped tone of the officer with the clipboard. The smirk when he said, "We'll see how long you last here." The overturned trash cans. The suffocating lawsuit. Suddenly, the pieces clicked together with cruel precision. It was never about offense. Never about shutters or trash cans. It was about greed, about power cloaked in rules. About one man's plan to cash in on other people's lives. David sat back, his hands gripping the edges of the table, knuckles white. Anger burned in his chest, hotter than it had ever been before, but alongside it came something else, clarity. For the first time in months, the fog lifted, and he could see the truth with razor-sharp certainty. "They're not going to get away with this," he muttered, the words heavy with resolve. He stood and moved to the window, staring out at his yard bathed in the soft glow of the street lamp. The roses, the porch swing, the fence, all of it was more than property. It was memory, heritage, sweat poured into wood and soil. They wanted to reduce it to a line item in a spreadsheet, but to him it was everything. With trembling fingers, he gathered the incriminating documents into a folder, sealing them tight. For the first time since the nightmare began, he felt a spark of power shift back into his hands. The HOA thought they had buried him. What they hadn't counted on was that their own greed had left a paper trail, and David was ready to follow it straight to the light. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, a low hum of tension that seemed to press against the walls. David sat at the plaintiff's table, his palms resting flat against the polished wood. The documents he had gathered sat neatly in a folder, but it wasn't just paper he carried today. It was the truth, and he had more than anyone expected. Across the aisle, the HOA board members sat in a rigid row, their suits sharp, their faces tight with smug confidence. The president leaned back in his chair, lips curled into the faintest smirk, as if victory were already secured. Their attorney shuffled his notes with casual assurance. David's heart pounded, but his eyes burned steady. When the judge called his name, he rose, voice steady though every nerve in his body screamed with adrenaline. "Your Honor," he began, "the HOA has accused me of countless violations, and they've presented photographs as evidence. But what they never expected was that I, too, have evidence of how those photographs came to be." The attorney for the HOA scoffed. "Mr. Johnson is grasping at straws." "Quiet," the judge interrupted sharply. "Let him continue." David nodded, then lifted a small USB drive in his hand. "For months, I've dealt with harassment and fabricated accusations. Out of desperation, I installed security cameras on my property. What those cameras recorded," his voice caught for just a moment, then grew stronger, "tells the real story." The courtroom screen flickered to life as the footage began to play. Gasps echoed almost immediately. Grainy but unmistakable, the footage showed two men slipping onto David's property under the cover of night. They wore dark clothes, their faces briefly caught in the beam of a security light, faces that belonged to HOA board members sitting right there in the courtroom. The video rolled on, capturing them deliberately knocking over trash cans, scattering garbage across the driveway. Another clip showed them prying at the wooden fence until the panel cracked. One man crouched, snapping photographs of the staged mess before hurrying away. Whispers rippled through the gallery, shock breaking into audible outrage. A woman in the back covered her mouth with both hands. One juror shook his head in disbelief. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. As the final clip ended, the silence that followed was thick and damning. David turned toward the judge. "These so-called violations weren't accidents. They were staged. My home wasn't falling short of community standards, it was being sabotaged by the very people meant to enforce the rules." The HOA president shifted uneasily in his seat, the smirk gone, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. The attorney fumbled, papers slipping from his hands as the weight of the footage hung heavy in the air. When the judge finally spoke, her voice cut like steel. "This court dismisses every fine and citation against Mr. Johnson. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the conduct of this HOA board." Gasps gave way to stunned silence, then hushed chatter. David's chest rose and fell with a deep, trembling breath. The suffocating weight that had pressed on him for months seemed to lift in that single moment. The board members sat frozen, their once confident masks shattered, replaced by the pale, hollow faces of people caught in their own web of lies. David sank slowly back into his chair, relief flooding through him. For the first time in months, he felt the ground beneath him steady again. His home, his dignity, his truth vindicated. The battle was not over, not yet. But the tide had turned, and for the first time, the system had spoken not against him, but for him. And in the silence that followed, one thought rang clear in David's mind. Justice had finally found its voice. The afternoon sun bathed the neighborhood in a warm, forgiving glow as David stepped onto the familiar sidewalk leading to his home. His feet crunched lightly on the gravel, a sound that had once been comforting, now carrying the weight of months. He would never forget. The battle had ended in his favor, but the echoes of harassment, intimidation, and betrayal still lingered in his chest like a quiet ache. He paused at the edge of his garden. The roses he had painstakingly trimmed months before now bloomed with reckless abandon, their petals glistening under the sun. The porch swing swayed gently, creaking softly, as though welcoming him back after the storm. Everything seemed alive, renewed, but David's eyes lingered on the subtle scars, the faint scratches on the fence, the patch where a board had been replaced after vandalism, and the memory of overturned trash cans still fresh in his mind. He drew a deep breath, letting the familiar sense of cut grass and warm soil fill his lungs. Relief was there, yes, but so was a cautious awareness that peace could never again feel quite so simple. Still, the house's home stood steadfast, a monument to the trials he had endured and survived. From the corner of his eye, movement caught his attention. A neighbor he hadn't spoken with much since the first letter approached slowly, hands nervously folded in front of her. "David," she said softly, eyes downcast. I should have spoken up sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. I saw what was happening, and I stayed quiet." Another neighbor, a man who had once passed by with polite nods but no words, stepped forward. We didn't know how to act," he admitted, voice low and trembling. "It wasn't right, and I'm ashamed it took this long." David listened, his jaw tight. Emotions stirred frustration at the silence, sadness for the complicity of inaction, but beneath it all, a sense of quiet triumph emerged. He nodded, acknowledging their words without anger. The past was immutable, but the present offered him clarity. Speaking truth, standing firm, and protecting what mattered could inspire change, even in those who had once looked away. He moved to the porch steps and leaned against the railing, feeling the rough wood beneath his hands. The swing behind him creaked in the breeze, and he allowed himself a rare, small smile. His gaze traveled over the garden, the fence, the neatly painted shutters, the home that had weathered more than anyone could have imagined. Each corner carried a story of perseverance, each flaw a reminder that resilience was not measured in perfection, but in survival. The street was quiet again, but now it carried a different energy. Where tension had once lingered in shadows, there was now cautious respect, acknowledgement of the truth that had been laid bare. His neighbors, once silent witnesses, had seen the courage it took to stand alone and the integrity it took to see. Justice served. David straightened, standing taller than he had in months. His home was more than a property now, it was a testament. A testament to struggle, to patience, and to the unwavering refusal to surrender to intimidation. Every board of roses, every creak in the porch swing, every freshly painted shutter spoke of a man who had faced overwhelming odds and had endured. And as the golden sun bathed his house in light, David felt it in his bones. He had reclaimed not just his home, but his dignity, his pride, and his place in a neighborhood that could no longer ignore the truth. He exhaled slowly, letting the warmth fill him, knowing that while scars remained, so too did the proof of resilience. David stood on his porch as the late afternoon sun draped the neighborhood in a soft amber glow, painting long shadows across the street. The roses in his garden nodded gently in the breeze, as if acknowledging the quiet victory that had been hard-won. Months of harassment, intimidation, and unjust fines had left scars, both visible on his property and invisible in his spirit. But the ordeal had also crystallized a truth he could never forget. Injustice often hides behind polished rules and official letters. For so long, those letters had seemed harmless at first glance. Printed on crisp paper, stamped with authority, they carried the weight of bureaucracy and the illusion of fairness. But David had learned the painful lesson that appearances can deceive. Behind each neatly typed line lay a design meant to intimidate, to push him out of the home he had built with sweat and care. The HOA's rules were not about community standards. They were a mask for greed, a tool wielded by those willing to sacrifice others' dignity for profit. Yet in facing them, David discovered the power of courage. Courage, he realized, wasn't the absence of fear, but the resolve to act despite it. Every letter he challenged, every piece of evidence he gathered, every confrontation he endured became a step toward lifting the veil. Courage had allowed him to strip away the disguise of authority, revealing the truth that had been there all along. And when the truth emerged, projected across the courtroom for everyone to see, the silence that had protected wrongdoing broke. Even those who had seemed untouchable were brought low by the undeniable evidence of their actions. But the lesson went deeper than exposing others' misdeeds. David looked around his yard, at the creak of the porch swing, the vibrant petals of his roses, the neatly painted shutters. His home was more than walls and fences. It was a testament to identity, history, and perseverance. Each corner carried memories, choices, and years of careful care. A home is not defined by ownership papers or the approval of neighbors. It is defined by the life and dignity of those who live within it. As he walked through the garden, fingers brushing lightly over soft blooms, he thought of the neighbors who had stayed silent, the friends who had averted their eyes, and the strangers who had underestimated him. Yet even in their hesitation, there was a lesson. Silence can be complicit, but truth has the power to awaken conscience. The smallest acts of courage ripple outward, forcing even the most entrenched bystanders to reckon with reality. David leaned on the railing and watched the street, breathing in the warm, golden air. Justice had not been simple, and victory had not come without struggle, but it had come. And it carried a message far greater than fines dismissed or threats nullified. It was a reminder that when we refuse to be intimidated, when we protect our dignity and stand for what is right, even the weight of authority can be challenged. Home is more than bricks and mortar. It is more than rules on paper. It is the embodiment of who we are, the legacy we leave, and the space where courage and truth converge. And as David gazed at the house he had fought so fiercely to protect, he knew no one could take that from him. In the end, the most powerful bullies, no matter how polished or official, can be brought down when light meets deceit and courage meets fear. And that was a truth David would carry, quietly but firmly, for the rest of his life.